So one of the most famous Christian metaphors comes from a book written in 1660 by Puritan John Bunyan, and you probably have heard of it. It's called Pilgrim's Progress, and it fleshes out in vibrant stories and metaphors this idea that the Christian life is a life of a pilgrim. And if you haven't read it, it's a fascinating story because it describes all the twists and turns of a Christian going through life. And his name is Christian. It's not very subtle. And he starts off living very comfortably in this city of destruction, and he has a burden on his back. And he has worries, and he has doubts, and he has anxiety. And he starts off this journey, a pilgrimage, seeking deliverance. And the rest of this book is about that journey. And he avoids characters like Mr. Worldly Wise Man, and wrestles with a temptation to try and become right by obeying all the rules. He dodges arrows from Beelzebub. He is delivered finally from his burden with this mountain with a cross on it. And then he narrowly escapes the influence of this well-dressed man named Formality. He walks through the fearful valley of the shadow of death. There's one episode where he's trapped, he's imprisoned by a giant named Despair, if you know the story. He becomes friends with people with names like Faithful. He teaches young guys with names like Ignorance. And he never really finds his home. Christian never feels at home. He's always traveling. He's a pilgrim, making progress with a destination in mind. And finally, in the metaphor in the story, he crosses through the river of death and he is welcomed and at home in the joyful celestial city. You know, when Ewoud Dykshoorn looked back and thought about his life, that's how he saw it. He was a traveler. He was a pilgrim. He was never really in a permanent home. He was always with his eyes set on heaven through some good times and through some really tough times. But he was always headed toward the celestial city, heaven. This is what Ewoud wanted you to know about him. And I think most of you know his story, but he was a pilgrim. He wasn't even a citizen here. He grew up in Holland during a time when the world was rapidly changing. When he was a teenager, right after, I think it was right after his 15th birthday, the German army invaded Holland, turned everything upside down, and in addition to some other massive disruptions, they conscripted him to work, and the Nazis put him to work, I understand, at what he called the ration office, and he worked with rations. And his teenage job, if his numbers were a little off, the Secret Service invaded Dutch homes looking for Jewish refugees. And that's how he grew up. After the war, there wasn't a whole lot to do in Holland. He went to Indonesia, as we've talked about. And I've heard so many cool stories from there. But one of my favorites is when he meets his wife on leave from the army. And you know what happened, right? But can you imagine that conversation? So I've got a couple more weeks. Do you want to marry me? And it'd have to be next week. And then you're going to have to move to Indonesia. And it somehow worked out, which is amazing. Of course, after the army, he moved, he worked in Indonesia, and finally he came to the United States, here in New York, where he raised his family. You know, there is so much to admire and celebrate about this man, but one of the things I loved about him was that he never got too comfortable where he was. He never lost sight of the fact that he was on a journey. He never lost sight of his destination. And it always popped up for me in kind of funny ways. But I think when you have the vision to see how unstable life can be, one of the things you get is a more sure, more confident desire for God as refuge, or you can't handle it. One of those two things happened. But I think when you, like Ewoud, has seen what this man has seen, here's someone who learned things about God that I don't know that we'll get to see, that God is a dwelling place through all generations, and we are at a loss. because we got to see firsthand the quiet, humble, faithful strength that comes from knowing that this is not our home. You know, Ewoud would tell me this in kind of funny ways, I thought, but when I first moved to Goshen, I had a brand new baby son, and he didn't sleep much, and sometimes I'd walk into church a little bit tired and worn out, and I sat next to Ewoud every week, but sometimes I'd make the grave mistake of complaining to him. I learned better, because I would say things like, you know, I didn't sleep last night, I have a newborn home, and he'd say things like, I had a newborn once, more than once, and then I saw him mentally count in his head. He said his wife and him had something like 45 plus infants. And he'd tell this story about how he would, you know, it was amazing. He and his wife would take newborn infants from the hospital and keep them till they were ready to be adopted. And the more at the time, I was thinking about it as someone who just had a newborn at home, and I thought it was a terrible idea. But he looked at me and said, I know exactly what you're going through. One's tough, I did it like 50 times, and God was faithful, and somehow that made me feel a little bit, okay, not that much better, but it got me to stop complaining about anything. Or there's this one other time, I don't remember who it was, but somebody was upset about some kind of conflict at work, coworkers gossiping or doing something really terrible to somebody else. And Ewoud talks, and everyone listened when he talked. He said, I too have had conflicts at work. And they told this story about this one time when one of his plantation workers came up behind him with a machete, trying to decapitate him, and it was conflict at work. We're like, wait, that's a little different. And then he said, of course, God was faithful. It's something like you lean down to tie a shoe or something, and I only have a scar on the top of my head now, and all. And I think we all just kind of walked away going, wow, that's, I don't know how he did it, but he had this way of making us feel a little bit silly about what we were complaining about, but he did it in a way that encouraged me to trust God just a little bit more, because life is hard, and it's always changing, and you could always trust God in all of it. And I guess it seemed like Ewoud always saved his best stories when people were afraid. And I'd sit with him in groups, and sometimes people in church world, we are a fearful bunch at times. And I was in a group of us, and people were worried about the news. Our country is changing, our culture is changing, even our kids are changing, even our church is changing. And I think there was someone is talking, really worried about rising gas prices or something. What are we going to do? And Ewoud just, you know, it was the kind of thing that lots of us kind of get worked up about because we think our lives are so fragile. And he starts interjecting something. We all looked at him. He said something like, you know, I remember when the first car drove into our village. Before that, we didn't have cars, and I think gas prices are going to be okay. Yeah, he kind of had this way of saying, look, life is full of change. It's unstable. Sometimes it's really hard. None of us are in control. We don't even know what tomorrow is going to hold. And his stories proved over and over again how much life changed just in his lifetime. But for Ewoud, I think he'd also say that little fact, that life is so unsure, should do something. And it did something for Ewoud. For Ewoud, it pushed him into the arms of something or someone who you can trust, God himself. I think for Ewoud, life is supposed to be hard. One of the things that does is it reminds you that we're not at home. You and I, we don't really belong here. We're just pilgrims. If you're a Christian, your future may be the only sure thing in your entire life. This, of course, isn't Ewoud's idea. It wasn't unique to him. He would be the first one to point out that this confidence, peace, and security is taught everywhere in the Christian scripture. Now, some people, the thing that sets saints apart is doing miracles or having a halo, or people think that if you're a godly person, you're close to God, that makes you, gives you a comfortable life. But if you look at Scripture, that's not the case. It seems like the thing that makes, let me put it this way, the thing that is true of godly people is they have pilgrimages. And I think Ewoud would probably back up this statement by reciting off his head Scripture he'd memorized, or he'd talk about the development of pilgrimages in the Reformed tradition. But he's really just asked me to elaborate on one verse, and he wants this to be short. So this is Hebrews 11:13. Hebrews 11:13. This is what God's word says. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on the earth. Let me just unpack this one phrase at a time. I'm not going to do anything too complicated. He asked for a really short service. The first part, all these people were still living by faith when they died. Of course, if you want to know what that's talking about, you'll have to read a good chunk of Hebrews 11, because you'll find a long list of pilgrims who trusted God. You'll see names like Abraham, Sarah, Moses, and so many more. But for Hebrews 11, what sets apart faithful people is simply that, they live by faith. They actually believe in God. They actually trust, and they really follow a stable, firm, trustworthy God, even, maybe actually especially, when life is really hard and unstable. And you could read their stories in Hebrew 11. But I think Ewoud would read this chapter and say, you know what? I think that describes my life. The second thing I want to point out is that, they did not receive the things promised, which, by the way, is a weird thing to say about faithful people. It's more about God. To say that God made promises to people and they didn't get them, it's kind of an odd thing to say. But here's what it does say. They only saw them. They saw the promises. Do you see it? And they welcomed them from a distance. So God makes promises, and he keeps them eventually, but after they die. So take Abraham, for example, right? One of the guys in chapter 11. Abraham was promised descendants numbering like the stars in the sky, or like the sand on the seashore. But when he died, God really didn't keep that promise. My math isn't great, but his family could probably fit in a minivan at that time. But Abraham actually believed that life was just a stop on the journey, and that death was actually just the beginning of God's faithfulness. And Abraham, of course, was right. Or take Moses, right? He's in Hebrews 11. He never got to set foot in the promised land, but he too believed, he actually believed that his death was just the beginning of God's reward, his faithfulness, and his blessing. Do you know what's true about these folks? People like Abraham, Moses, and Ewoud, they were stable, they were faithful, they were humble. Do you know why? Because they really believed in God. And that belief, and believing too that life was just part of a pilgrimage, that belief gave them freedom to not get unhealthily attached to wherever they were in this journey, because they really believed that the best was yet to come. So they had a very loose hold on this fading life. The last part of this verse is the best part, because we get to see the secret about how people like you and how me and how Ewoud can live a life with this sort of quiet, confident humility. Hebrews just says it right out. They were admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. In other words, to live by faith, to to welcome and to look forward to amazing future blessings in heaven. To do that, you have to admit the fact that you're a pilgrim, or as the old song says, this world is not your home. I'm just passing through, right? For Hebrews, actually, if you want to look, it's Hebrews 11:6. Faith is two things. Faith is believing in God, so all the things we attach to that. And a lot of us just stop right there. But faith is, and you can see this, it's chapter 11, verse 6. Hebrews is also believing that God is a rewarder of those who seek him. Faith isn't just believing that God is. Faith is believing that God rewards those who seek him. And right now, I just want you to imagine something. What if everything we just talked about is true? Because here's the tricky part. We like to lie to ourselves. We like to imagine that our lives aren't moving, they're stable. We like to think that we can stay exactly where we are, that we somehow have the power or ability to hang on to life, and we pretend it will never get old. We like to imagine that sickness will never affect us. We don't like to ever think about the fact that right now I think the human mortality rate is right around 100%. We like to think that where we are right now is stable, it's forever, so we make ourselves at home, we put down deep roots, and this is why funerals are so uncomfortable. But deep down you know that this isn't home. You know that this doesn't last, right? You know that none of us will live here forever. So what if Ewoud was right all this time? What if Scripture is true? What if this life was never meant to be home? What if it was a pilgrimage? What if it was always supposed to be a journey? How might that change you? What if all of God's promises of blessing and of comfort and of peace and of security, what if it was never supposed to be given to you right now? What if any blessing you have right now is really just a down payment on God's eternal generosity? And what if all of the things that we get so anxious and upset and worried about, the things that give us anxiety or suffering, what if all of that was just a step in your pilgrimage and this really wasn't home? And what if all the good things that you could count, all the blessings you could count, what if all of that was just a tiny taste of what God may have waiting for you in eternity? And what if you would actually get rewarded for seeking after God and trusting him with the sort of things that you can't control? You know, I think that if you believed any of that, and you should, because all of that's true, I think, well, let's take what that would look like. I think you would start to be able to handle an awful lot more in life. Because if it's just temporary, if it's just a step, I think you could handle it. I think we'd have to be more humble, right? Because you would start realizing how little control you have over life. I think what else? I think you and I would become more free to live generously, because loving people and serving God, well, it's no sacrifice, no matter the source of inconvenience, if you're looking forward to the reward in heaven. I think if we really lived like we believed all this, I think we start having profound peace. We would be unshakable when things try to knock us over a little bit. And I think we would start trusting this eternal God to get us through this temporary life. And I think we start to have joy because we're starting to really look forward to our rewards. I could keep going, right? And we could start talking about more and more different things that would change about each of us if we really believed that life was a pilgrimage and the best was yet to come. I think that would change an awful lot about our lives. But instead, I'm just going to say this. I would point out that if you live your life as a pilgrim, I think you might look an awful lot like Ewoud, who lived his life like he was a pilgrim on a journey, and now he's arrived. He is enjoying in eternity what he looked forward to his entire life because he loved and he trusts and he found his refuge in Jesus Christ. So Father, this morning can be a time of rejoicing because Ewoud, your child, is finally home. And after going through the pilgrimage of life, he has finally gone into your reward. So I pray that you would help us to learn from him. I pray that you would comfort us. And I thank you for his example and for the reward he is now enjoying with you in heaven. I pray that you grant us comfort and help us to be more focused on you. In the name of your Son, I pray. Amen.